Don't be like Jesus, the topic of Christian nationalism. So I come into the July 4th holiday as an American with complicated feelings about my country and especially how my faith relates to it. There's a lot of religious language and symbolism that's been showing up in American politics lately, particularly in the right wing. And this can be troubling and confusing sometimes because the way that religious symbolism is used is often very different from Christ-like moral principles. You have critics trying to point out that there are inconsistencies of, say, rejecting immigration or punishing policies about poverty while still claiming to believe in the Old Testament prophets, or in trying to control the country from a religious perspective while believing in the Sermon on the Mount. But Christian nationalism is not the same thing as Christ-like morality, and it's not trying to be. It has its own principles, and it's actually pretty consistent with them. A prime example is back in the middle of June, US Congresswoman was giving a speech. It was actually in a church, and she was trying to answer critics who had been saying, how many AR-15s did Jesus have? Her answer was, well, he didn't have enough of them to keep his government from killing him. The lesson, of course, was to do better, right? Don't be like Jesus in this case. She's literally using Jesus as an example of what not to do. Now, of course, Christians who didn't follow her politics scoffed at her quite a bit on social media, but her audience, meeting in a church, cheered over it. It's easy for somebody who doesn't agree to write off a thing like this because we just figure everyone is going to see that that's ridiculous. That this doesn't really square with the teachings of Jesus, but that's not really so. In fact, Christian nationalism sees itself as a genuine Christian perspective, and criticisms of the policies saying they don't really square with biblical morality are generally brushed off. The Bible is expansive enough that one can come up with the theology one chooses from it. So I wanted to talk about what Christian nationalism is, how it's different from both Christianity and from politics. And I wanted to give some perspectives on it. I was really excited to find, as I was reading my books about Christian nationalism, how many things resonated in here from other classes I teach. I love finding crossovers in material that I teach, and I teach psychology of religion, world religions, church history, and Adventist history. So I'm going to be talking about all four of those perspectives at least a little bit. And in here, because of the visuals, I'm just going to zoom in on the visuals so you can see that instead of my face for this point. Now, when Lauren messaged me a few weeks back to ask if I would cover this topic, I was really excited by it, and I immediately went online and ordered some books. And this one that I'm showing you the cover of here was the most fascinating. I was actually disappointed when I got it to discover that it wasn't talking about the historical perspective, but then I was really surprised to discover that it really was a very fascinating and helpful book, even though it was not about history. I don't know what's up with that, but Taking America Back for God talks about real fairly rigorous research that's been done in the Baylor University Religion Study, covering a decade apart about the topic of Christian nationalism. It also brought in other research done from other sources, and it was fairly high quality research. It was looking at their processes. I could really get behind this one. So what is Christian nationalism? This is the first question. It's not Christianity in the broad sense. It is actually a cultural framework, an ethnic cultural identity in which being a Christian or assuming that name is part of that identity. And the defining feature, in fact, the factor used by the research to define Christian nationalism and to measure it, was the idea that America was specially chosen by God among all the nations, very similarly to Israel in the Old Testament. God specifically set up the United States of America to serve a specific purpose in the world. And because of that, the country should have a kind of covenant relationship with God. Just like Israel, the US needs to uphold Christian morality in the land in order to get God's blessing. And also, we have an obligation to use the biblical term, fill the earth and subdue it. We have some of this belief going back to Calvinist Protestants coming to the Americas and seeing this space as the promised land and modeling their relationship to it as like the conquest of Canaan. It's a belief that the US has to have this special relationship with God. It's also an ethnic and a cultural identity, and its ideal is white Northern European descended Americans and people of other backgrounds who assimilate to the same culture. So this is not exclusively about race or about national origin, but it does bring with it the expectation that all peoples of the world who end up citizens in America are going to culturally assimilate rather than changing the culture to make it more pluralistic. It uses the language and symbols of Christianity, but its values are really more about national loyalty and authority structures than New Testament morality. And this is kind of necessary because anytime the church in its history has united with empire, way back in the Roman Empire, it suddenly takes on all the concerns of government. And so its focus and the rules of the game have to shift in order to take on the responsibility of managing society rather than simply representing the message of Christ to the world. So we have extensive research that was done on Christian nationalism by Baylor University. And they did the same survey in 2007 and in 2017, so they could track trends a decade apart. And what they did was they created a kind of Christian nationalism scale. In psychological research, when you're doing research through surveys, you want to avoid asking people about terms that have a moral value associated with them. So you're not going to create a survey and ask people what's your level of Christian nationalism, because this has a moral and political value attached. So instead, they created a series of questions in order to measure the Christian nationalism affiliation of the person responding. They created a scale, essentially. It was questions like, how much do you agree with the statements like the US or Christianity should have a special place in public life, Christian prayer should be allowed in school, it's appropriate to display Christian symbols like the Ten Commandments in courthouses, etc. And these questions created a scale, and depending on how people answered the questions, then they were evaluated for how they respond to Christian nationalism. They grouped people into 4 categories. And I would say the thesis of the book is that Christian nationalism is ubiquitous enough that everyone in the US has to respond to it in some way. Some embrace it and some reject it. And then you've got groups in the middle. So they grouped everyone into 4 categories. Rejectors, those who completely deny the validity of Christian nationalism. Resistors, those who maybe not so strongly opposed as rejectors, but don't believe that it's really valuable. Accommodators, those who aren't deeply sold on it, but are still fairly comfortable with some of the assumptions. And finally, ambassadors, that would be somebody who's fully sold on the America as a Christian nation idea. In the book, I found quite a few charts and scales and things making comparisons, and I'm going to skip a bunch of that, but I do recommend this book if you're curious about it. However, I did want to point out something else about the definition. It's easy to try to simplify what Christian nationalism really means and to oversimplify it. In political surveys, especially when polls are trying to rate people according to how they're going to vote, we generally see not Christian nationalism, but evangelical Christians. If you identify as an evangelical Christian, this is how you're likely or not likely to vote. But it's not exactly that. The survey showed that there was discrepancies between evangelical Christianity and Christian nationalism. There's overlap, they're not the same thing. Equally true with identifying with the political right wing. There's a correlation between these two, but they can be measured as separate factors and they can behave as separate factors. Also true is racism. It's sometimes said that Christian nationalism is simply a veneer for racism, a way to favor white Americans because they're more likely to fit into this cultural group here that Christian nationalism favors. And it's true that there is a lot of content about race going on under the guise of non-racial terms. And yet this also is not the same thing. These all can be ferreted out and measured separately, and you can see different factors involved. Another thing it is not the opposite of Christianity. Obviously, someone who disagrees with Christian nationalism but does identify as a Christian is going to be uncomfortable with nationalism taking on the name Christianity. And I have seen pundits saying this is the opposite of Christianity because it's pushing ideals that are contrary to the inclusive gospel. However, I think to be technically accurate, we've got to be honest that Christianity embraces a lot of concepts. Christianity has meant a whole lot of things over the centuries in which it's existed, including the Roman Empire, that association there. So although Christian nationalism is often in conflict with the morality of Jesus, it is not the opposite of Christianity. We can't back out of that identity that easily and say that's not us if we don't like it. There's definitely a strong correlation, and we just have to let the term Christianity be broad because that's what it is. All right, also, I noted with interest that there was a separate factor with religious piety or practice. In trying to evaluate how much Christian nationalism follows along with the actual practice of Christianity, the survey came up with 3 practices: attending church, reading the Bible, and regular prayer, and measured people along those lines as well. And there is a correlation, just like there is with evangelical Christianity, the political right wing, and even anti-Black racism. But again, like all of those things, they work separately. And I'm going to get down further on and see how the practice of Christianity often works against the influence of Christian nationalism. But that's a little bit later. All right, after identifying Christian nationalism and at length ferreting it out and dividing out all these other things that are associated with it, the rest of this book is used to talk about 3 primary values. And I'm going to cover them here briefly because I'd like to talk more about history and also how the Adventist church relates to this. The first value was power. This shows up in politics a lot. Power for the right people meaning Judeo-Christian, generally white European descended Protestant groups are supposed to have the largest voice in the US government because the government is supposed to be a Christian nation. Christianity gets a special place of prominence and everybody else is allowed, they're accommodated, but these are the people who are supposed to be in charge, and this is the culture that's supposed to dominate. So the use of political means for cultural transformation or cultural control, preventing it from being transformed into something different. There are lots of ways to try to lead in a culture, and not all of them require political power. But Christian nationalism does believe that political power is a legitimate way to influence society and that it's okay for the church to use the political arm to enforce its moralities. The second value was boundaries, separating the right people from the wrong people. Some Christians may look in the New Testament and say God is about breaking down dividing walls in humanity. Others look at it and say God puts up walls, especially the wall around Jerusalem, the rebuilding after the captivity in Babylon, and God is about dividing the right people from the wrong people and protecting people. Boundaries are seen as protection, as safety, and outsiders are viewed as dangerous, particularly outsiders of a different ethnic and religious group. This focuses a lot around Muslim immigrants. The last of the values would be order. This is a social hierarchy, which does encompass, say, a racial or an ethnic hierarchy, but also a gender hierarchy. There's a leaning into patriarchal traditions, the idea that human beings have to be in these nuclear family groups in which you have a male leader, and this affects their beliefs about the proper roles for women and also the legal status of women. And this comes out less these days in terms of male and female gender roles, and more in terms of a sense of threat from sexual minorities. Someone who is gay or someone who is trans or otherwise doesn't fit into the box is a threat to this gender hierarchy, because you don't know where this person belongs, right, in the system. Furthermore, it causes others to question their place in the system if you see somebody else who's not playing by the same rules. So Christian nationalism tends to see, say, gay marriage or trans rights as existential threats to itself, things that need to be, if not eliminated, pushed back out of the view of society so that everyone will keep in their order. I wanted to add a little bit of insight from some other disciplines to that definition of Christian nationalism, because this is not strictly a phenomenon that happens in the United States in our time and place. It's a phenomenon that's happened all throughout time and to a great number of religions as well. From psychology of religion, we see that religion has a broader definition than simply a set of beliefs. In fact, there's a list of basic components of religions that I make psychology of religion students and world religion students memorize. And they include things like doctrines and ritual or worship and morality. They also include identity and community. These are basic components of religion. This is how religion can grow away from being a focus on certain teachings and certain moral behaviors to being more about a culture and what group you belong to. And of course, the downside, belonging is a great thing, right? Identity is a useful thing in human psychology. But the downside is that when you create an in-group, you have automatically created out-groups, and the tendency to be protectionistic against other out-groups is pretty natural too. In world religions also, I teach students that religion is culture to some degree. We like to think of our faith or our religion, our Christianity, as being about what we believe and how we behave because of it. But really, religion encompasses so much more. It becomes culture. It is present in language, in our social structures, in our understanding of law, in the way we view history. It just shows up everywhere in culture, so that it's hard to always tell which ideas came from religion and which came from culture and who's influencing who more. Because of this, religious nationalisms are very common. In fact, the majority, not in number of adherents, but the majority of total religions are what we call ethnic religions. these are religions that are associated strictly with one particular people group, and they don't cross cultural boundaries and they don't proselytize. There is a phenomenon some decades ago where white Christian youth were interested in adopting Native American religions. And were surprised to discover that Native Americans weren't all gung-ho about adding more people in. But if your religion and culture and even your identity are the same, it just doesn't make sense to say somebody can come in and become a Native American believer any more than they could become a Native American descendant by choice. There are, however, 3 acknowledged missionary religions. There are, of course, converts sometimes to some of the ethnic religions, such as Judaism particularly. But the 3 acknowledged missionary religions are Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. And these religions cross cultural barriers. They go from one place to another. Because of that, they also have some identity issues when they do that. We know this because we all know about the stories about European and American missionaries of Christianity going to other parts of the world and bringing not just the Christian faith, but also their own culture and trying to convert people to a whole host of ideas beyond simply the ones taught in the scriptures. So from psychology of religion, we learned that identity and having an in-group are normal components of religion. And from world religions, we say that religion and culture get to be intertwined, and we get religious nationalisms out of this. We have Hindu nationalism that comes up and creates a certain amount of political violence. We had Shinto. It had a dramatic influence on Japan before and during World War II, because we've got Shinto teaches or taught that the emperor is actually descended directly from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and because of that, you have a religious loyalty that you can command as the leader of the nation. And of course, that had to undergo a shift after it didn't work out very well during World War II. So religious nationalisms are not a new thing, and of course, Christian nationalism is not a new thing for Christianity also. There's a long-term relationship with empires going back to the Roman Empire when Constantine adopts Christianity and identifies with it, and going through the history of Europe. And because of this, we have a consistent pattern of behavior that conflicts with Christianity's moral teaching. Things like the Crusades or the Inquisition. Hard to justify biblically, but these are natural results of Christian nationalism. All right, so what about America? There is, of course, much debate when we talk about Christian nationalism about whether that's legit and whether we should say that America is a Christian nation and should behave like it. So what about America? Is this a Christian nation specifically? And does that mean that Christianity needs to have an important place in public life? There are evangelical voices, certain niche historians, who say that we have rewritten American history to write Christianity out of it. But it was really founded by people of faith, and it was built on their faith. And then this, of course, means that it's perfectly legitimate to return effectively to a marriage of church and state. The reality, of course, is more complicated because reality is always more complicated than any story we tell in order to promote a particular policy or behavior. And in this case, we have multiple strains coming in to the 13 colonies and multiple perspectives. And so the answer to it, was America founded as a Christian nation, is kind of maybe yes and no. On the one hand, we have Puritanism. Puritanism is primarily, it's a Calvinist descended Protestant religion. Calvinism believed in the union of church and state, and that one of the roles of the government was, to defend the proper faith. The Puritans believed that God had created our society and that God interacts with humanity through a series of covenants. Since God created the whole of society, not just the church, but the government, it's all right for them to work together. So when Puritans come to Massachusetts and similar areas, they want to create not a pluralistic new space. Instead, they would like to create a holy commonwealth. And it interacts with their theology in fun ways, because there's the issue of individual baptism and an individual commitment, and how does this relate to the point that this is also supposed to be a Christian nation or a Christian colony, and being a citizen here is also being a Christian, and that's fun, and we could talk about it some other time. But you have Puritanism working there. You also have places like Virginia, which was supposed to be Anglican, but that didn't last very well. We got more Puritans, and we also kind of lost the religious influence as slavery was embraced. So each of them many tried. The Puritans tried much harder to create a religious society. And really all of these colonies also created a very specifically Christian morality code that they expected everyone to adhere to. All right, we also have strains of religious pluralism at work. Some of the colonies are very strongly Puritan, or the attempt to make an Anglican majority there in Virginia, which eventually breaks up. Some of them, though, are founded specifically intending to embrace pluralism. Now, many of these are embracing pluralism for purely practical reasons, like Maryland. Maryland is founded as a Catholic colony. The King of England's trying to make some concessions to Catholics, trying to get some support against the Puritans who are outmaneuvering in Parliament at the time. But of course, Catholics are the minority. So they're going to have to embrace religious tolerance there. So Maryland's essentially a space for religious pluralism. Then you have some leaders like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who end up founding areas in Rhode Island, what is Rhode Island now, specifically because they believed in religious pluralism and in freedom of conscience. While you had places like New York and such that embrace pluralism because it's best for trade, it's how you get the most people in town, it's how you do the best economically. Williams and Anne Hutchinson believed that people's consciences should be free and the government shouldn't be involved in your faith. Roger Williams also believed that colonization was morally wrong and that the British government had no right to that land. William Penn is the most successful of the people who wanted to create religious tolerance. He founded Pennsylvania. He himself was a Quaker, and Quakers were very sensitive to the issue of religious freedom and liberty of conscience, probably because they are persecuted. And well, Pennsylvania is temporarily run by Quakers. It's deliberately embracing religious tolerance and advertising for colonists based on that idea. So this is another strain. We've got the Holy Commonwealth that the Puritans tried to create. We also have religious pluralism. Finally, showing up, at least by the time we get to the American Revolution, there's the influence of rationalism and deism. Major influential founders of the revolution were actually skeptics and rationalists. This didn't mean that people were anti-Christian. In fact, deism is not specifically anti-Christian or anti-theistic. Deism, though, is looking for a religion without having special revelation. You should be able to look around the natural created world and understand enough about God and about the fate, your fate in eternity, in order to have good moral behavior. Rationalism actually shows up not that long after the Reformation. By the time you get to the second generation of the Reformation in Europe, it had caused so much violence, so many religious wars. The Reformation gets wrapped up in wars over succession or fights for political independence, like the English Civil War or the Low Countries Rebellion, Both of these are Calvinist groups. And you get terrible bloody wars like the 30 Years' War, which just decimated a whole population. And then the persecution of Protestants in France. And people begin to think that maybe the problem is we shouldn't be fighting over all this dogma. In fact, maybe dogma isn't very useful to us in the long run because it means we can't compromise with the other side, right? Once you have a spiritual allegiance to a certain side, it's hard to come up with a compromised position. So rationalism is looking for an alternative source of morality. Deism proposes that we can come up with a universal religion, which everyone can ascribe to, if we stick to just revelation, just what we can see in the natural world, and not special revelation, that is, not the scriptures there. A part of this rationalism are certain French thinkers like Voltaire, de Montesquieu, Rousseau. And from here, we get ideas that we've embraced in the United States in our government, the idea of religious tolerance. De Montesquieu says dogma, Rousseau says dogma was a human corruption. And these thinkers also proposed new forms of government, like government's supposed to serve the people, and even the idea of three powers that would balance each other out. And you can see how these ideas get incorporated into the initial government in the United States. So we've got a mixed bag at the founding of the nation. Is America a Christian nation? Not explicitly so, although it is founded by people who are culturally Christian, who are steeped in the language and symbols of Christianity, and who are going to use religious language and concepts in their political acts, because in speeches, this is going to draw in the crowds and create buy-in for their ideas. All right, so the bottom line, though, as the Whitehead and Perry in Taking America Back for God point out, frustratingly, is that it doesn't actually matter. When we get down to it, whether or not America is a Christian nation, the historicity of it isn't as important as the reality that it's believed in. What's important isn't what actually happened in the past, but what people believe about what we should be doing now. And the belief that that America was supposed to be a Christian nation has a profound impact on what people believe we should do now. Where does this idea come from? Well, somewhere in the early 19th century, there's a purposeful attempt to create a story, a narrative about the United States as a Christian nation. Remember that you've got a plurality of people here. We've got different backgrounds and different faiths, and we've got a very short history. And so that short history, shared history that we have, it becomes much more important. We've got to place a lot of emphasis on that short time that the United States has existed in order to create a sense of identity and a feeling of purpose in the world. And so we create a national myth somewhere in the 19th century about this Christian nation, which was created by people who were looking for religious tolerance. They came to this space for their faith in order to found this space of the real expression of Christian faith, which is liberty and justice for all. And then that myth, now using the term myth as meaning a story with a value attached to it, not primarily about whether it's true or untrue, but that national origin myth gets pulled out different times in our history in order to deal with certain political realities. You get a resurgence of it after the Civil War. You've got the lost cause theology that is actually resisting Reconstruction after the Civil War, say, no, the real way to get God's favor back and thrive as a nation is to go back to this ideal where everybody kept in their place and in order in society. You also get a resurgence during the Great Depression. Now, I read about this, and I'm hunting down the book that I need to learn more about it, because I was intrigued by this idea. Capitalists, those in big business, were resisting the economic reforms in the New Deal and using the idea that we're a Christian nation to buoy up tradition and to resist change for economic reasons, apparently. After World War II and to the Cold War, we've got the US versus atheist communists. So we've got another resurgence of Christian nationalism, or of the America as a Christian nation ideal. And it shows up again in the civil rights movement. And this is, again, pushing back against the full inclusion of Black Americans, pushing for this particular cultural identity and against plurality culturally. There you see it right there. In this image here, you've got a parade, America first, the sign says, one God, one country, one flag, and there's the Ku Klux Klan marching there. What's the purpose of this, of pushing the ideal of a Christian nation? It's almost always done by someone with the political agenda in mind. It allows racism to exist under non-racial language, and also to enable gatekeeping. We can't have too much immigration because this would change our identity as this Christian nation. Resistance to change or reform, like we saw with the resistance to economic changes, and also a way to spiritualize politics. There are times when US voters are asked to defend and to endorse policies that aren't really in their best interest, but if you can attach a spiritual or a moral authority to those policies, then you get some loyalty there. So the idea of America as a Christian nation is very commonly used to reach a particular political goal. So what about Seventh-day Adventists? What do or what should Adventists believe? How do we relate to Christian nationalism? Of course, this has changed over time, like everything else has. Adventism has a kind of a touchy relationship with the government of the United States. You probably recall that at its foundation, during the Millerite movement and the generations beyond, we've got a lot of deep associations with the abolitionist movement. And you have that Revelation 13 prophecy, where Adventists traditionally identify the United States as the lamb-like beast that enables and supports the dragon. And at the time, slavery was the prime example. Obviously, a nation which is willing to tolerate and embrace slavery is going to have no compunctions about someday allowing religious persecution when it feels like it's in its best interest. And this is our reminder that, while the United States has some nice things about it and some nice advantages, we don't give our full and complete endorsement of the government, because it's not always going to be a great place for us. It's the message. We also have, I've recently been discovering or learning from others about the Adventist Church and anti-imperialism, Adventist voices resisting American imperialism in its early centuries. And this is where I've got to strongly endorse, oh man, I'm losing the name here. I'll mention later. Okay, we have A.T. Jones. A.T. Jones is our religious liberty guy for a time in the late 1800s. And he, besides pushing against laws for Sunday observance in the United States, he also protested when the US annexed the Philippines, building its own empire, saying that imperialism is actually bad. Percy Magan, who is famous for his leadership of the Loma Linda, back when it was the College of Medical Evangelists, yes, even wrote a book called The Peril of the Republic of the United States of America. That's in 1899. And he's also pushing against the idea that America is creating an empire, and that this should be approved of. He says this is actually a bad thing. After you have the Opium War in China, and you have all these Western powers pushing their way in, forcing trade and access for Christian missionaries in China. We also have these same voices pushing back and saying the United States should not be creating a virtual or an economic empire there in China and overrunning the country politically and economically there, and actually defends somewhat the Boxer Rebellion, which is driving American missionaries out, because they say that the U.S. and other Western powers' policies there were unfair. They were wrong. In fact, they also say that international law, the way it was working at the time, was privileging the white nations, Europe and the United States, and gave them much more rights, much more better prerogatives, greater rights than other nations. And this is actually a kind of racism. So we've got some anti-Christian nationalist voices, because at the time that the Adventists are saying this, the majority of religious voices, Christian voices in the US, are actually good with it. Many Christian voices say that God wanted the annexation of the Philippines, even saying that God was an imperialist, because now the United States could civilize the inhabitants and support Christianity. And this sounds very much like the same language, the idea they called the white man's burden from earlier colonization. The idea that Christians have the right or even the duty to take sovereignty away from others because it's for their own good. You can hear the Christian nationalism in that, and also the tones of racism in it as well. The idea that we know better here. I wanted to put in this little bit of Adventist prophetic art here also, talking about Revelation 13. It's another image of the two beasts in that chapter. And here the lamb-like beast looks a little more lionish, but you see slavery and creeds attached to this beast, and we oppose them both. And then there's fire coming down from heaven, and somehow the steam engine, or the coal engine, I think it is, of the train is in the background. This is apparently tying into the prophecy somehow. Now, of course, all of this anti-imperialist, the United States is a beast theology is going to have a cost, and it did around World War I. In 1919, the U.S. Bureau of Investigation, the thing that became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, began to investigate the Adventist Church. See, we were selling the book Bible Readings for the Home door to door. It was one of the things that our call porters would sell as they went around. And it also included this idea about America as the lamb-like beast in Revelation 13. And this did not look very loyal at a time when the government is looking for disloyal groups that may be actually abetting its international enemies. At the time, there was another religious group, the Russellites, where leaders had been jailed. So there's some discussion about this during the 1919 Bible Conference, the very famous one that Michael Campbell's book talks about. There's concern that we might be an anarchist group, leftist, pro-labor, this sort of thing, and not really loyal to the United States. Of course, when I read that concept in Michael Campbell's book, now I want to look more into the United States and labor disputes and such, but that'll be for another day. So we have pressure to look more patriotic, to embrace our country and to be loyal to it a little bit more publicly. Carlisle B. Haynes, who was the liaison between the church and the US War Department in both world wars, pushed the language of Adventists are conscientious cooperators, rather than saying we're conscientious objectors. We don't want to take lives in war, but otherwise we are fully cooperative with our government because we're good, loyal people. And we do stuff like the Medical Cadet Corps by World War II. We also, around this time, somewhere in this mix, start to begin displaying flags in our churches, talking a little bit more patriotically, and of course, We've got to prove that we're anti-communist as well. This is all part of being loyal to our country. And so we've got a patriotic shift that goes on somewhere around here. And I'd like to do a little bit more research into how that happens in the specifics. So how about today? Well, this patriotic shift, you can see its influence today. Research tells us, studies tell us that Adventists are still fairly evenly divided in the US between the right and the left wing. I remember myself as a kid just having the sense that we just wanted to be apolitical as much as possible. But as very visible evangelical Christians push into politics more visibly, and as Adventists see ourselves more, especially since the 1920s and beyond, as associated with those conservative groups, then there's kind of a default that pushes Adventists to the right wing, I think, at least when they get visibly involved in politics. Again, statistically, this doesn't exactly pan out, but you see some, at least out in the public, association with that right wing. Ideally, I think the Adventist Church should still keep a nuanced view of who the United States is and what we should be long term. And, without current research, it's hard to see exactly what we're doing. All right, I am going to wrap up soon. I promise, I absolutely promise, but I wanted to draw your attention, to some present and future realities. Back to the idea of Christian nationalism versus Christian practice. This is some good news about it here. Christian nationalism and Christian practice can be closely associated with one another, but when you separate out these factors, as the analysts on the Baylor Religion Survey did, you can actually see those two factors working against each other. Now, they defined Christian practice, as church attendance, prayer, and Bible reading, because you got to have something objective to measure. And they found that the higher you rated on Christian practice, you could have some ideas that went equal and opposite to the trend in Christian nationalism. When asked their opinions about restricting immigration from the Middle East, requiring public acts of patriotism, rejecting gun restrictions, and disbelieving that racism is impacting policing, you had opposite effects for Christian nationalism and Christian practice. And I'm going to show you my very badly scanned images of charts in the book. And I know these are small and you can't read them, but the dark line ascending shows as Christian nationalism increases, people's agreement with statements like police treat Black and whites the same, or Muslim immigrants pose a threat of violence to Americans. That goes up as Christian nationalism goes up. The dashed line is Christian practice, things like reading the Bible and prayer. And as that increases, your agreement with these statements goes down. The one in which it's the opposite is the bottom on the left-hand side, where the statement was the US legislature should enact stricter gun laws, in which Christian nationalism, as it increased, their agreement decreased. As Christian practice increased, their agreement increased. You do have some opposing trends. They also discovered there is a shrinking population base. Now, you wouldn't know it by listening to political rhetoric, but actually Christian nationalism is decreasing population-wise. And I want to show you some tables. Again, that's probably fuzzy on your end, and I apologize for it. But you can see in the bar graph here, the first one is Rejectors, and the 2007 results are the lighter color, and the 2017 results are the darker. So the number of Christian nationalism rejectors increased and resistors increased. The number of ambassadors and accommodators decreased. They're still fairly large numbers, but the trend is going down. The line graph is showing Christian nationalist ideas among different political parties. So while the red line is Republican and it's decreased the least, it still has had a decrease. And then all Americans, independents, and those who identify as Democrat also decreasing. Here's another one showing generational trends. This shows in 2017 how much of each generation went into each group. And you can see the largest number of ambassadors is in the greatest generation. Then there are fewer ambassadors in the boomers, fewer in Gen X, and fewest of all in millennials. And we don't have a survey for Gen Z or beyond. The opposite trend with rejecting Christian nationalism, the largest number is among millennials, the smallest number is among the older population. So that generational shift is going to have some effect too. Of course, trends can always reverse, things can always go different ways, but the reason that the authors of the book believe this is the case is because you're having an overall reduction in Americans who identify as Christians, just as a whole. And so you're going to, of course, have less buy-in to the idea that Christianity should be calling the shots. You also have an increase in progressive perspectives, like support for gay marriage in all four of these groups. So even ambassadors are being slightly more likely to say gay marriage is fine than they were a while before. So there's a shrinking population. Why then do we have stuff like this, as you can see in the picture, Jesus wearing a political identity hat there in this picture? Well, because there's still a growing voice. And this is actually just part of the course for Christian nationalism. When the group feels threatened, it becomes louder. The idea that you're shrinking numerically simply supports the idea that that this ideal of America being Christian is threatened and it needs to be defended. Christian nationalism shows up more in times of unrest, and it becomes louder when it feels threatened or when it's shrinking. Of course, I think the last survey was actually in 2021 showing a decline. I'm not sure what the recent political events have done to it. Conclusion: Christian nationalism is sticking around. Even if it declines, say we don't like it and it's going to decline, that'd be great news, but decline's not going to be immediate, and it's going to continue to take a prominent position in US public life just because of the nature of it. I wanted to conclude with scripture. I wanted to have a biblical perspective here. And I thought about having texts like the warning about those who have a form of godliness or deny its power, or Jesus' prediction that not everyone who say he's their Lord is going to have a place in heaven. But I don't think it's good enough. It's not enough to figure out what Christian nationalism is and to say, okay, well, do I agree or disagree with it? This doesn't fix the thing. We have to have a response to it. So I pulled up this text instead. Luke 4:17-21. In it, this is the story of Jesus very early in his earthly ministry, going into the temple and reading from the scripture. And it says, the scroll of Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where this was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. He rolled up the scroll, handed it back to the attendant, and sat down. All eyes in the synagogue looked at him intently. Then he began to speak to them. The scripture you've just heard has been fulfilled this very day. Here's the point. If I don't agree with Christian nationalism, if I believe that it's not lining up with the morality that Jesus taught, the point is not simply to figure out which side of the issue that I'm on. I need to also I need to grow that influence in the world. If I really believe that Jesus' ministry is about inclusiveness, about ending oppression, setting captives free, making good news for the poor, then that's how I need to be using my influence in society. The best answer for a form of Christianity that's focused on consolidating its own power is practicing a Christianity that will empower others, one that behaves like Jesus.